panel, who's going to reflect on what you've heard right now, and the moderator of that panel is Paula Griswold, who's the Executive Director of the Mass Coalition for the Prevention of Medical Errors.
Thank you, Melinda, and thank you so much, Michelle. Really exciting to have the opportunity to hear the results of this first U.S. study. We've been waiting for years, and just fantastic, and as consequential as we had hoped. There's some really powerful messages here. So again, first let me start with our discussion panel to have some reflections on this, and then we'll invite Michelle back to join the panel and take your questions. So do go ahead and start thinking about your questions. Our panelists include Linda Kenny, Executive Director of Medically Induced Trauma Support Services. On the end, Terry Ott, who's a Claims Manager with Bay State Health. Pat Folcarelli, the Interim Senior Vice President of Quality and Safety at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. And Jeff Catalano, who's a partner at Todd & Weld Law Firm. And I'd like to start actually with a question for Jeff. As an attorney with long experience of working with these patients, although I noticed you taking notes when lawyers as angels were mentioned. Might be the first time it's been said in this room.
I have to tell you, that surprised me the most. Lawyers as angels appearing in a PowerPoint at the Massachusetts Medical Society. I'm half expecting it to rain frogs outside or something. It's crazy.
But beyond that, from the conclusions from the study, I'd be very interested in what most surprised you about the conclusions from the study.
It's interesting. I feel like I'm surprised that I'm no longer surprised in a pleasant way. And what I mean by that is this study revealed that lawyers serve a valuable role in the whole process. And that is something that would have surprised me hearing about 5 years ago. But I'll tell you, from the time that Dr. Woodward and Charlie Algero invited me and others to hammer out legislation to open the door to this kind of program that allowed for more transparency before a lawsuit. First time in the history of Massachusetts that lawyers and doctors got together and hammered out legislation like that. I recently had a meeting with Speaker of the House, Robert DeLeo, and he commented on that, and he said he's never seen anything like that as far as collaboration goes. So that was a pleasant surprise, and then I was pleasantly surprised to be invited to be on MACRMI as the only patient's attorney representative. So I guess it doesn't surprise me now that there's this full disclosure now saying that lawyers serve a valuable role. It's something that I think MACRMI understands. I think it's something that emanates from the patients themselves. What role do we play? Well, as you saw, we're a facilitator. We help people to sort of process the information that's coming at them. Diane had mentioned at the last panel how emotional this process is. And I think many of you can attest to the fact that when you're being told that something happened to a loved one or to yourself, that you can't really process all the information that's coming at you. And some of what's coming at you might be misinterpreted. Someone saying they're sorry could weirdly enough be interpreted very negatively by someone who hears that in a way that makes them angry. And so a lawyer can help them process that. Then, of course, down the road, a lawyer has a very important role in talking to them about the settlement agreement and the legal terms of that, negotiating liens, which sometimes intervene, and you have to negotiate those downward, otherwise whatever you're offering is going to be discounted substantially. And then sometimes, if the person is impoverished, and you offer them money, they're no longer impoverished, and they lose their benefits. And so, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. And so there's all these things that go into an analysis. And but most importantly, I think we can help the patient to listen to the information, and we can communicate information to the doctor that maybe they didn't, or whoever's having the meeting, that they didn't get through the investigation. So often the patient has a story or a family member has a story that hasn't been elicited. And I think that that's where, again, the lawyer can help facilitate that discussion.
Thanks.
From a claims point of view, Jeff, I can sympathize with what you're saying, because there are often times when we have cases where we have the patients in the hospitals for a very short period of time, and even if we do explain what happened, because the event is so traumatic to them, they may not retain, they may not hear. So when they come to see you, you can emphasize what we've explained, and you can clarify questions for them that maybe we hadn't gotten to and maybe didn't do well enough. Mm-hmm. So you have the time with them that we don't have, and you can have the conversation that brings it down to something realistic, something that can bridge the gap between their anger and where they should be or where they are and where we are as a hospital.
I agree.
So thank you.
Yeah, I agree.
Great, thanks. And how about, could I turn to you, Pat, from your perspective at the hospital? Which of the concerns that you saw from this study do you think is the most important to tackle right now?
Well, there's a lot of concerns. I think the one that surprised me, or at least made me pause to think about how we could address it differently, is the one that was about closing the loop about things that we've changed in the system that will prevent it from happening, and how are we doing that with the patient. So if you listened carefully to the patient Tricia on the video, she mentioned very quickly something about that the doctor said that they would be changing something that would prevent this from happening again to another person. And so that even in her quick summary, that had big meaning for her. But sometimes what happens is, for us in particular, where we've passed our case to be closed out, and the closing is with an attorney and with the claims representative at the CRICO side, we may have done a lot of work in the hospital to mitigate the risk for that happening to another patient, but we don't mark a closure for the event for the patient. So you could imagine this could be accomplished in a few different ways. One would be that at the time of settlement, it could be an opportunity for the hospital to reach back out to the patient and say, we continue to be sorry for what happened to you. We don't do that now. And here's what we've done to mitigate the risk for this happening to another patient in the future. So there's that opportunity. And then these corrective actions sometimes evolve over time, and we don't really, we've marked through this program a lot of improvements and standardization of how we're communicating with patients and families at different markers during the progression of one of these cases. But we don't often then, when we're considering them closed from the hospital side, pause to say, is this the opportunity to reach back out? So it took me by surprise. It's a blind spot for us. And it's something that we want to bake into our systems going forward that I think would be really meaningful. It gets back originally to the same thing that we heard earlier this morning, that you have to ask the patients and families what they want and be prepared to listen to that and then to remember what they said they wanted. You know, maybe it's a lecture to be named, maybe it's coming back to talk to a team of physicians for their grand rounds. Unless you ask, you don't know. So I think the thing that surprised me is there's real opportunity for loop closure on the hospital end.
Absolutely.
And I will just add, after listening to patients and families for so many years, that part of their closure is meaning making, and knowing that someone else will be saved from the harm that either they or the family have experienced helps them, you know, on some level, especially if you've lost a child. It just feels like another family won't ever have to suffer that kind of pain because maybe their son didn't or daughter didn't die in vain. So it's really helpful.
I was also wondering, as Michelle was presenting that, how much that specific patient or family would have been asked themselves. Did they have suggestions for what could be different in the care? So at the point that you're coming back, they're also having that chance to see that they were heard.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And it's another opportunity to get that information at a time when things have calmed down a little bit. And the patient and the family may have had the opportunity to talk to other patients and families and hear that there's other ways to do it. So I think for a lot of reasons, this is a really important thing that we can consider intervening.
Great, thanks. How about a question for you, Terry, as a claims manager? What were your reactions to the findings as far as how does that reflect your experience in the room with patients and families?
Well, at Bay State, in the room for me as a claims manager doesn't necessarily mean the patient's room, because that's not where I belong. That's where the first conversations take place. For me, in the room means either a conference room or I can go and meet with the patients in their homes. Nobody's baked a cake for me, but I have been invited for pizza. So we have discussions. I feel sometimes that I'm I'm the last person that can actually listen to them, because we talk about resolution, but it isn't just resolution. It's building trust. It's an ongoing relationship that's been lost somehow or shattered. And it's my chance to reach out to them and help somehow make them whole in some way, but also make sure that we still have that ongoing relationship. If I have information to give them regarding any safety improvements that we've made, I share that with them. It's not just the financial component. That's not what they're looking for all the time. They want to know what you're doing, as we've said. And it's also, like I said, my chance to have that relationship, that ongoing relationship with them, to make them come back and say, hey, it's not as bad as I thought it was. So that's my room, so to speak. It's either their home or a conference room or a quiet place where we can have a conversation.
And you're another opportunity for them to feel heard.
Yes, absolutely. It's again, when I meet with them, I know that they've told their story before to many people. So by the time they've gotten to me, they may have told their story 2 or 3 times already, but I give them the opportunity to tell me again, and I ask them if they'd like to, because sometimes they may say, look, I've already talked about this 1,000 times, and I do know the bits and pieces, but I do want to hear it from them and their words, just to see, to see their reaction and to see just how deeply they feel about it. To have that conversation and to make that eye contact and see if we can connect.
Thank you. And how about a question turning to you, Linda? As someone who hears from patients who've experienced this kind of harm for years now, for patients and their families, what of the points in the study stood out for you as the things that most struck you? What struck you as most important?
I think it was involving children, because I usually hear from the parents and not the children, so that was interesting. But the siblings was surprising too. We have heard from people about how, if it happens to the parents, how do they, help the children? But I didn't think of that, because it's been 17 years and my adult children still want to rake my husband over the coal for not, telling them what was going on. So it's, that guy is never going to get over this from my kids. But I just know that I think even being mindful of, even if it happens to an adult person, how, is there something we can, do you need help with your children? Do they need, any support going through this? This must have, because honestly, I know that's what we could have used, and I hear that over and over from family. I'm not being a great mother. This has really done a job on me. What about my kids? There's only so much you can do. But actually, what I did love, I turned to Pat about that New Zealand comment about people being on a crusade. And I said, that's why we have mitts, because I didn't get it, and I was on a crusade. But I find that less and less people are doing that today because, number one, there are more consumer organizations, but there are more opportunities to get involved in patient safety efforts than there ever was in 1999. So that's a testament to you guys, and it's a real honor to be part of this community that is putting one foot in front of the other and trying to do the right thing. I just know, for me, when I went back in to finally have that conversation 3 years later, before I even got to say anything, everybody said, well, we looked over your chart and we don't see anything wrong. And I know they were doing the best that they could. It was 2002, so. But I didn't even, they didn't ask me. I was there to talk about, I was not even there to talk about my case. I was there to talk about what we could do moving forward together. And I remember being very disappointed. So I think that was another great thing, is ask the patient, meet them where they're at. So I think there's lots of great things we can learn from this. And I know that Michelle had been talking about doing this with patients for maybe 4 years prior to this even happening. So she's been hot on this, and I'm really excited that they finally had an opportunity to do that with patients.
One of the things that I can offer too is from the claims point of view, when we do have claims, and we do speak with patients and families, and especially when we have children involved, we've had a couple of cases where we've actually reached out to the families to see what it was that they needed at the moment. long before the final resolution. We've had an adult case that was a quadriplegic patient where we went through, and I met with the patient and his mother and his attorneys, and we talked about what he needed at that point in time. Resolution came months earlier, but at that point in time, as a quadriplegic, he went through a lot and he had a lot of needs, and we met those.
And looks like, Jeffrey?
Yeah, I guess I would like to expand upon something that I said earlier, which is also really important to this whole process. It's very important that you hear what the patient needs, and Terry said that very well, and also to hear, just let them get their emotions out. But there's something that has to be really considered when these conversations are happening, is that these patients need to be part of your investigation. Because when you're doing an investigation into standard of care, which can be a little bit murky sometimes, it's not always evident in the medical records, and it doesn't always come through the clinicians. They're not always going to volunteer everything. And I'll give you an example that many of you can probably relate to. If someone's in the ICU and they suffer sudden respiratory arrest and cardiac arrest and they die, very often that is considered to be an unpredictable event. However, if a family member is interviewed, and many times they're there at the bedside, and they can tell you, I went to the nurse several times to say, something's wrong with my dad or my mom. She's having a hard time breathing. That's not being written down by the nurse. And then, so that's not in the medical records, but it is within the family members. The family members have that information. So what happens oftentimes is in these cases where I get the word that it's unpredictable event and there's no standard of care deviation, I then file suit, and nobody does due diligence like a good plaintiff's lawyer. I'm sorry, but the peer review process is not that thorough. Many, many times I depose people who are critical and who are around, and I say, was there a peer review meeting? And they say, no, I was not involved. Or I ask, were you interviewed or did you talk about this event afterwards? And they say, no, just generally that we're sorry this happened, but no digging down as to why it happened. So you depose that nurse, and maybe you find out that, yeah, the family member came to me. What did you do? Well, I called the attending, and the attending didn't come down. So now you find that there was something that went wrong, something that was predictable and preventable. But this comes out of the family member's mouth, and you have to think about those family members as being as valuable to your investigation and to the cause of that adverse event as any doctor, as any medical record. And if you're uncomfortable having that conversation that deep with the patient, and I can see the hesitation because you're getting down deep into it, it's almost like a deposition of sorts, well, that's where the lawyer comes in and can facilitate that and say, let me tell you what I know now. I've not just spoken with the one family member who you talked to, the wife, but also did you know that his children were there too? And they have some information that might be very important for you to know about. So until you've really done that kind of analysis and truly listened to the patient, and not just their emotions, but truly listened to their version of the facts, which are just as valid, if not more, than the medical records, then you haven't really completed your investigation. So that's one of my recommendations if we're going to really do this process in the purest way possible.
That's a good point. I want to mention something else too. Is a therapist once said to me at the beginning of my journey, she said, talk to anybody who will listen, because that was part of the therapy. But do you remember that case that was all over the newspaper about the surgeon leaving while the gentleman was on the table having back surgery? Well, I happened to run into the patient, and he was talking somewhere, and he was saying who he was, and I'm like, so I had an opportunity to talk to him, and honestly, the minute I said, wow, I've heard something about your case, how are you doing? He went from detail to detail to detail into the case. Now, must be 10 years, which told me this man hasn't had an opportunity to talk about his case enough. And so I gave him my card. It was not at a business function, but I thought, oh my God, I felt bad for the guy because he didn't have the opportunity for people to listen to him.
Yeah, thank you. Some really interesting points, and we should think about for our best practices to definitely have the patient and family feel heard, and there might be improvement opportunities that you would be missed if those conversations didn't happen. So yeah, that's a fabulous point. Anything else from our panel? Well, how about if I invite Michelle to come join the panel at this point, and let's go ahead and take questions from you, either for Michelle or from any members of the panel. So please feel free to come forward to the microphone.
Good to see you too.
Yes, sir, please.
Nobody mentioned anything about data breach. And I realize that it could be either a system problem or an indiscretion on the part of a treating person or a loss of a laptop. And I wondered how that is dealt with differently, if not the same.
So a data breach as an error
Data
that
breach
the
as an
hospital
error,
might be
yes.
dealing with. Pat, is that something
You
you
know,
come?
we do have whole systems for data breaches, and I think we're not unique in that a lot of hospitals now have grown out whole departments that are just for data breaches and compliance issues because the rules associated with reporting those are very different. We work very closely with that group in patient relations within the hospital so that we know who's the one who's communicating with the patients about data breaches. But it is a good question. It parallels in terms of the things about transparency, standardized communication, an overlay of regulation, but also closing the loop about how you're going to prevent it from happening again with patients. Good question. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Michelle had talked about one of the things about doing early payments. And, you know, even in our processes, it does take some time. And maybe Pat or Terry, could you talk about your experience in trying to get creative and giving some early payments to engender the trust while the processes are moving? Because I think there are some good examples.
Yeah, I can speak to a specific example of a patient who had an injury that we knew at the time of the injury was going to require multiple surgeries. And what he was starting a new job and was going to require payments as this progressed. And so that was a case where we were able to work with CRICO, and who was our malpractice carrier, and they were able to provide reimbursement for the patient all along. It was clear negligence on our part, clear injury that was causally related. And, but it's not easy for patients to advocate for this, for all the reasons that you've described. But when I think it's probably easier when it's clear what the injury is and that there's a causal relationship. I think it becomes more complicated when you're waiting for the resolution of the full injury to assess the damages. But there's definitely ways to do it. For things that are a little more creative that we can do at the hospital end, I mean, there's some things that are just nice things to do, facilitating appointments, paying for parking, helping with meals, finding out if there's any other kinds of things that people need help for at home that don't require the equivalent thing of a claim. But there's things you could do. And there are ways for CRICO to do interim payments on our behalf. It requires a little bit of creativity, a little bit of persistence, and it's possible.
We have a case as well, and I had mentioned the quadriplegic young man that I had gone to see at his home, and I met with him and with his mother and his two attorneys. And as we walked around the house, basically, I asked what it is that the patient needed. And I had a list, and it included things like sheets, large sheets for a very large bed. It included a new ramp, if you've seen the handicapped ramps that are aluminum, that are portable. This young man's chair used to go off the ramp occasionally, you know, and his mother and father used to have to lift the chair with him up in it. So we helped him get a new ramp. The other thing that we did is he had no form of transportation. There was an old van that the family used to have to plug in every single night, and we got him a van. And he was able to pick out the van, and without that van, that man had no life. He was stuck in this little house. Friends wouldn't come and see him anymore. He couldn't speak. Having a new van gave him the ability to get out and to go to ball games and to go to the park and to have a life, and to be able to interact with friends that he'd had in the past that, you know, they sort of gave up on him. So there are things that you can do. You just have to think about it, and you have to be open to it. No can't be your first answer. There's ways of getting around it.
And Terry, that's a really interesting example, because much as clearly one of the lessons was ask because you can't imagine all the things that might matter to the person. I imagine the converse might also be true, which is the person hasn't yet imagined what would be helpful to them.
Right.
So you're having the experience of ideas to help them think about it. Seems very helpful.
And let me tell you one thing that this young man did. He had read in the paper about a little girl, and the story was in the paper about a little girl who her parents couldn't take her to appointments because they didn't have transportation. And he donated a vehicle to that family, so he played it forward so that they could take the little girl. It was amazing to read that.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yes, Sigal.
Hi there, Sigal Bell from the IDMC. I just wanted to applaud this amazing work, and it's so exciting to see us delving into the patient experience after a long time of wondering and hoping we can learn more about that. My question actually follows up on your comment, Paula, regarding patients who don't necessarily know what they want or need in the moment. I think there's an intrinsic limitation to the research that we can do, as Michelle pointed out, with statute of limitations or waivers, where patients are often far beyond that initial period when we're asking them, and so their perspectives about what would have helped or what helped may be different 3 years out than they would have been in the moment. And so I'm curious what thoughts people have about how we straddle that gap and how do we try to understand more about what patients need in the moment. The little that we've tried to explore that, what we hear is that needs change over time, and it seems like a more longitudinal approach to following a cohort over time may help us to better understand the epidemiology of how those needs change. And I have one other comment I just wanted to make. I can do that separately.
Oh, yeah, why don't you stay at the
Yeah,
microphone and
yeah,
we'll come back
great.
to it. Yep, so are there comments on, or?
I think this is the beauty of having a close tie with patient relations in an ongoing way with patients and families, where the patient and family might be more likely to tell a relations staff member what they would like than the clinicians, and they're more creative. And they they've seen a lot of things before, so they can offer things that they have seen that have worked for other patients. But the opportunity to follow people longitudinally would be wonderful. I mean, getting patients to agree to this study, or to just recruit patients just for this study, it's difficult. So I think a longitudinal thing would be fantastic.
I just want to say, I talked to a patient's wife once. I don't want to mention the case because it might give it away, but she said, we get discharged. I'm worried about even just how to care for my husband. It's all overwhelming. And the hospital was trying to do the right thing. Let me just say that. And she said, and they sent me a fruit basket. What the hell was I going to do with a fruit basket? And I'm thinking to myself, you got a fruit basket? But so just so you know, there are people trying to do the right thing. We are always just sometimes don't hit the mark.
Well, along those lines, I feel like, Pat, your comment about some suggestions, maybe part of the recommendations that emerge from this can be that we should be putting some options on the table for patients and families if they don't come up with them on their own. Similarly with, how can the organization learn from this? Because someone mentioned like a named lecture. They may not know that that's even possible, right? So like, how do we kind of almost create a menu in a way and be flexible enough to personalize it? So that's that. The comment I wanted to make is I actually found the comment about the social workers to be fascinating, because I can tell you when we train clinicians, we do it in an interprofessional manner on communication skills after harmful events. And when we ask them about their take-homes, we say, what did you learn today? And they say, always bring a social worker. So, so this is either, one of those classic situations where clinicians and patients think differently, or there's something else here, and that's what I would draw a cautionary note to, which is that oftentimes, social workers are amongst our best communicators, and they can really help conversations that, patients may not otherwise know may be very different in the absence of a social worker. I noticed some of the recommendations are also around having sort of a patient liaison, and in many cases the the social worker, may serve in that role. So it may not be quite as rigid as, wait on the social worker.
Yeah, if I could speak to that. So all 11 of patients who made comments about social workers, we're talking about the initial disclosure. Right. And so I think part of this is just having the emotional intelligence to appreciate what patients' needs are at different stages of the game. And I believe that in the initial disclosure, their needs are predominantly limited to clinical information. What are the implications of this event for my treatment going forward, and why did it happen? And that is information that the care team, narrowly defined, is best positioned to answer. Once we shift into connecting them to other services to meet their needs, then I think it's much more appropriate to involve others. And then when we shift farther along the continuum to talking about money, then it's inappropriate, in my view, to involve the clinician. And other research that we've done suggests that keeping the clinician in the conversation at that point actually devalues all the work that you've done leading up. It devalues the authenticity of the initial disclosure and apology.
Yeah.
Interesting. That makes sense.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I have a question that's a little different in terms of all these care programs that have been going on for the last several years is wonderful and fantastic. But if you have a patient, for example, there's a patient may have come to this meeting, for example, and they did not know all these things that are being offered, and at the time that their injury occurred, let's say maybe 12 years ago. Is there anything that, and they never really sued the doctor, for example, or anything, but they still have ongoing needs? Is there anything in the care program that can help these kinds of patients where they may have been injured, like quite a few years ago, or is it just care only for things that happen in the now and going forward?
Well, it's really, the intention of what we rolled out was for things that are going forward now. But I'll tell you that every single time there's an article in the Boston Globe, or there's something in the public media about this kind of a program, there are patients who call the hospital who have had events like this in the past. Either it's related to physical harm events, to harms related to disrespectful treatment in the hospital, and those patients are given voice the same way that we would for something that happened yesterday, because of the needs of the patient. And patients generally know that it's 12 years after an event, that it's beyond being compensated for in a legal sense, but there are things that that patient may still want that are healing. One might be just to be able to have voice for the issue. So we don't ever say to someone who calls, because this is 12 years ago, we're not going to talk to you. They're given the same voice, but they may not have the same legal rights as someone else.
So when does legal part get terminated? Like, is it 7 years, or what is there a
Depends.
limit?
3 years.
Yeah,
3 years?
Yeah, from the date that you learned or should have learned that you were harmed.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question first for Michelle and then for any members of the panelists. I'm interested, and I realize all of the challenges of why people hadn't done the study for so many years, but do you see that it has implications for how care could go forward, and with some quality improvement process of asking something from patients and families, even in the course of the care program?
Yeah, I do. So we've talked about a number of specific ways in which the care program has already incorporated some of these learnings. But one of the things we heard from loud and clear from patients is they want the institution to check in with them about how they did in the care process itself. Obviously we have a bias sample. People who wanted to talk came and talked to us, and perhaps some don't want to talk. But everybody who joined our study expressed the value that being able to give feedback to the institution about their performance in this process had to them. We gave people the option to share their full transcript of the interview with the institution. Lots of people took us up on that, even those who didn't wanted a summary to be delivered to the institution. So I think the opportunity for QI is something that they've started doing at Stanford now, which is 2 to 3 months after the closure of the process. They will do a debriefing interview, and it's usually conducted by somebody who's not directly involved in the case, but a higher level person within the insurer, who will ask the patient about their experiences going through the process. And they have learned a lot. They've learned a lot about differences among their staff and their level of skill in conducting these conversations, particularly around money. They've identified particular staff who need to be train further in how to not be a lawyer in those situations. And they've really heard from patients that it has been meaningful to them to loop back. The other thing that some institutions do, and I know this is something that's been part of Rick's practices over the years, is to touch base with patients at meaningful points later on. So on the anniversary of the event, for example, to check in, to let them know that they're not forgotten by the institution, and perhaps to update them on what the institution has done in the previous year to make care safer.
And has there ever been a downside of that process at Stanford, that follow-up?
No, I mean, at this point, you've been through the whole thing with the patient. If they're a person who's inclined to sue, they would have sued.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I ask you, at the end of the whole process, is it appropriate for people to say, we want to see how we're doing? Would you mind if somebody calls you in 3 months, if they haven't expressed an interest, so that you actually have that permission beforehand, but it's somebody, okay.
See, the trick there, if you have offered compensation, though, at that point, then an attorney would have been involved necessarily, because, again, no court, I mean, the law would require that the attorney would process the fee agreement.
I saw the wings in the room. I knew you were there.
No. Thank you. No, but I think what the point I'm trying to make, though, is that you have to, if you're going to reach out to the patient again, it kind of has to be through the lawyer, but the lawyer should be invested enough, he or she, that they would want to then know what's going on, a year later after the compensation, but when you've then promised to institute some kind of patient safety measures. So it's just a technicality, that not quite a technicality, but something I want to throw into the mix when you're anticipating reaching out to the patient sometime thereafter. Unless the lawyer and the patient agree ahead of time, look, you don't need to call me anymore, feel free to call the patient directly, and then you don't have to worry about any weird ethical violation you might be committing.
So it might be a plan in advance with the patient and the attorney about how to do this follow-up.
Yeah,
Yep.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, thank you. Yep. Yes, sir.
Dr. Rosanna, I've watched this whole process evolve over the last 10 years, and I want to acknowledge that without Attorney Catalano, I don't think we'd be here having these discussions today. Thank you.
Well, that's nice.
Can you say that again? I just want to record it.
Oh, wait, please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.
All right.
The what? Patricia?
So next I'm going to introduce Rick Boothman, who probably doesn't need any introduction, but he is the Chief Risk Officer at the University of Michigan Health System, and he pioneered one of the first of these approaches, and he's going to talk to you today about the national perspective on communication and resolution programs.
Thanks, Melinda, and thanks for the invitation. I want to congratulate MACRMI on 5 years. It's a remarkable thing. And you may not realize, or maybe you do, what an inspiration you are to me personally, but to so many programs around. You've not only taken these ideas in a really authentic way, but to create a community of learners and to create this expansion and this almost to the point of normalizing this approach as what we should all expect is remarkable and deeply gratifying to me. I do want to pick up on something that Dr. Gessner mentioned that he made to begin with. When I first got the phone call from Alan Woodward, 2003, 4, 7, somewhere, it seems a lot longer. Just to set the context, that year, a leading scholar was on a program with me, and I explained my ideas and I explained my rationale, and I had some early data about claims. And when he got up to speak in front of an audience of almost 500 people, he pointed at me and he said, "This man will single-handedly bankrupt the University of Michigan Health System." I don't bring that up because I felt abused, although I did call my wife and say, is it 5 years from when I started or 5 years from today? I need to get another job lined up. But I bring it up because how remarkable it was that the Massachusetts Medical Society and Dr. Woodward had the vision and the courage then, when that was the norm back then, to actually push this forward. So I've seen MACRMI before there was a MACRMI. But we need to, I think, give a round of applause to Alan Woodward and the Mass Medical Society. I'm deeply honored to call him a friend. So a number of folks had wish lists. We know that Jeff Catalano wants Halo, and Michelle Mello wants a cake, and Linda Kenny now wants a fruit basket. We need to make notes about those things. But I have my own wish list. I hope that I'm invited for the next 5 years. But as we go year after year, I hope the discussion changes. Because today, if I have a complaint at all, it's way too much about money. And that's really not what this is about at all. This program is a gift we give to ourselves. This is not about dollars, apology saves dollars, sorry works, that's not sorry works. This is about driving a continual culture of patient improvement. This is about realizing the mission that everybody involved in healthcare is involved in healthcare for. We don't operate hospitals to make, well, most of us don't operate hospitals to make money. And healthcare providers don't get into this business because they get a lot of money out of it. In fact, you can make a lot more in commercial real estate. It's a rigorous world in which you stick your neck out. So what we want to do, and I want to remind you of this, and how do I turn this? How do I advance this? Oh, okay, wrong way. So the goal is to build and support a culture of continuous improvement and service to the core mission, the core healthcare mission. And I don't want to lose that. Now, many years ago, Alan Kachalia may not even remember this, but I had an argument with Alan when he approached me in 2008. Now, if you know Alan at all, you know that there's two things about him having an argument about kind of triggers. Number one, it's a little bit like arguing with Mother Teresa. He's so nice and so thoughtful, and it's hard to get ticked at Alan. But secondly, he's so intelligent, you almost always lose those arguments. When he approached me about doing a before and after look at the University of Michigan's claims data, I said no. And I said no at the time because I said exactly what I said on this slide. It is not about reducing money. It is not about reducing claims cost. It's about changing the culture from victimhood, where the caregivers feel victimized, to actually a culture of accountability. And honesty and transparency serve those cultures. Without those things, we can't get anywhere. But Alan successfully argued, as usual, that the elephant in the room was this belief, this unsustained, unfounded belief, that the minute you're open and honest with the patient, the catastrophic financial sky will fall in. And it's important to acknowledge today that we talk about claims in this context because of that reason, not because it's so important to start to dissect why it is that my claims seem to come down faster than theirs did. None of that really matters. Once we establish and admit to ourselves that we can be honest and we won't lead to financial catastrophe, let's move on. So the smart people in the room, like Michelle Mello and Alan Kachalia, need to figure out, I think, what are the metrics going forward about how this energizes true peer review, how this changes patient safety, how it reinvigorates the whole idea and maybe changes the whole idea about informed consent. By listening to patients over and over and over who have been aggrieved, it is such a rich environment to learn all the other ways we can improve, like transitions of care, and how do we set proper expectations so that if things go badly, people are prepared for that. That's what this is about, and that's the value of this, and there's got to be a way to somehow come up with metrics for that, not just look at claims, because claims data is very illusory. I can drive my defense costs to zero by cutting a check in every case that comes to my desk. What does that tell us? The only claims data that really matters, in my opinion, is when you reach the point which we have, where we can look at the numbers we spent every year, and we can say, we deserved all of that. They deserved all of that. We should have paid those things. When you get to the point where you can separate out groundless lawsuits from legitimate claims, and then you can say to yourself, I know exactly what we paid in medical malpractice costs, and this is what we should have paid, you can move on. And I think, and I really hope for MACRMI's sake, that we will move on. So all of these things are true. Clinical accountability via honesty, transparency is indispensable. But this last point, I think, is especially true. The CRP idea, the Michigan model, whatever you want to call it, is relentless service to the healthcare mission that is built one after another on the heads of patients who have experienced unanticipated, unintended clinical outcomes and were treated with compassion and were treated with principle that are consistent and supportive of the clinical mission. That's what this is about. So essential elements, I wanted to review this because I was asked to talk about the general landscape, and the general landscape is blurry. It's blurry because there's a whole lot of organizations that claim to be doing it, and by it, they mean they stumble into a settlement without needing litigation once in a while. By it, they mean that they paid on something where they had no defense. And I always said to my kids, it's not an accomplishment to love only the lovable. It's not an accomplishment to compensate the people where you don't have a choice anyway. So you need to be able to do more. I want to review the essential elements of a true CRP so that you can weed out those who claim to be doing it and aren't really or don't really understand. And sometimes those posers who are actually claiming to be doing it and really have no intention of doing it. It starts with notification of an unintended clinical outcome, not a claim. So many organizations don't even think about this until somebody asks for money. That's not what this is about. And I heard many people today talk about starting with a medical error. It's not starting with a medical error. It's having your finger on the pulse of your organization so that when somebody gets hurt in ways that are unintended, you fly into action, and the next thing you do is to stabilize the clinical environment, because that's your mission. As important as that hurt patient who's in my attention, as important as that patient may be, that patient's not the most important to me. The most important patient is the one we haven't hurt yet. So stabilize the clinical situation, protect other patients. That's what serves your mission. This isn't about financial amelioration. Then support the patient. Keep and unify that patient-physician, that patient-provider relationship. This isn't about waiting until somebody is so ticked off and they talk to Uncle Joe and they think maybe they have a claim and now they're asking for money. It's about getting there before they become alienated, before you've circled the wagons and made them feel like they were abandoned by you. It's getting involved and keeping that relationship, promising full disclosure. And Jeff Catalano stole my thunder on this. Listen, 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 because not only does that validate the patient's situation, but they provide invaluable information that needs to be bridged to your Sentinel event review folks. And that's a technical problem, and it's hard to do, but we've done it. You've got to build that bridge because you can't do an event review on incomplete information. You've got to have it all. So by building those connections, you'll actually get you'll serve your patient safety mission better. But secondly, in the same vein, you're going to support your caregiver. We have isolated those folks for far too long. We've let them think that they're the only ones ever who have made that mistake or have had a bad outcome, and they're not even sure why, but they suspect it was something they did or didn't do. We've got to listen to them too. And we need to promise all groups full disclosure, because that's the only way we're going to improve. Then we have to normalize a culture of honesty. This is rigorous. It causes us to get to the bottom of it. I don't help our organization by defending care we shouldn't defend. I do not help our caregivers by defending care we're not proud of. I don't help them by pushing them down a litigation path when they shouldn't be. And I don't help them by not sharing with the patient why it isn't a legitimate malpractice case. That's all part of the fabric of this. And by normalizing honesty, you create a much different culture. Then you share facts and conclusions openly with caregivers and patients alike. I'm often asked about legal protections and about violating privileges and all. Who cares? If your mission is safe patient care, if your mission is always focused on the patient you haven't hurt yet, what do you care about whether, I'm not going to say something behind closed doors that I'm not going to say in a courtroom, if you're focused on honesty. Then be principled and accountable. Compensation is a gift we give to ourselves. I can't cheat a patient without signaling to my organization that we can render less than stellar care and we get away with it. That is counterproductive to what we want. So if you're focused on financial amelioration, cutting a really sweet deal may get you a pat on the back. I think it's absolutely toxic to what we're doing this for and all the reasons. There's a huge audience on every one of these events. You may not realize it, but by acting in an accountable way, there was a question about statute of limitations. We have compensated 23 people who cannot sue us. One person whose statute was gone for 8 years. And he was a man whose wife was badly treated with Haldol at our organization. And when he was a professor at our place, and he had never achieved closure. And when he finally came to us because somebody on campus said, go talk to Boothman, I think he'll talk to you. We actually compensated him $250,000, and his wife had been dead for 8 years, long past any viable claim. Why did we do it? No, we're not crazy. We did it because it reinforces the importance of being accountable. And we made known all across the organization, that's why we were doing it. It's a gift we give ourselves. You've got to be consistent in peer review. You've got to be consistent. And sometimes the hardest thing about being principled is when you tell somebody they don't have a claim or you didn't act unreasonably. But you still have to do that. Then you have to leverage lessons learned. Most of the posers, most of the people who claim to be doing it have no connection whatsoever to patient safety. They don't plow in methodically the lessons learned. They don't consistently go back and say, why did this happen and how do we make sure that it never happens again? You've got to have that. And then lastly, you have to measure your improvement. And that's where I say to Michelle and to Ellen and all you data geeks out there, figure ways of measuring what's really important. Not that we were able to adjust that claims or cost line a little bit. So what are the characteristics of this model? Well, in a deny and defend environment, risk, legal, insurance is a tack-on. Those are kind of necessary business elements. Not in this model. Risk consciously adjusts its approach to the organization's goals. And I heard one thing that I didn't care for today when somebody said, well, if the organization thinks they could have and should have done better, we want to get, as the insurance company, independent reviews because maybe we are more objective than they are. I reject that. Insurance has to act in the best interest of the insured. And if the insured said we could have and should have done better, it should be also an equal and completely consistent mission with your insurance company that they recognize and respect that and act accordingly, because that's the only way you're going to establish a consistent culture of accountability. Conversely, risk and insurance and legal must not inhibit the big picture. When I was a trial lawyer, I realized after 22 years in the trenches, not a single client ever asked me what they should have learned from the cases I handled, but I also realized another bad thing. I was complicit in this problem. The better I got in the courtroom, the more likely it was I would win cases I shouldn't win. That's backwards. That is reinforcing to the organization that they can hurt somebody through substandard care and get away with it. They need to hire better lawyers, not better doctors. I'm sorry, that doesn't help in the long run. Fair compensation paradigm. We changed the compensation paradigm. We don't horse trade over possible jury verdicts. We are evidence-based when we talk to somebody about compensation, which also prevents us from skinning somebody alive, from cheating someone, from taking advantage of vulnerable people. And I think that that's important. That's also an investment in ourselves. And again, as I said, normalizing honesty. My 20 minutes start? It's not fair. So all of these things are important, but the last one, locked and focused on the core clinical mission, is really important. So where does that leave us? Well, there's lots of tensions. Human beings focus on the short term and don't pay so much attention to the long term. This challenges that. As scary as that birth trauma case sitting on your desk is today, what's scarier is the one that hasn't happened yet. But we don't think that way. Some of the ARC grantees' experiences, I think, yielded a very important lesson. If adoption of this method turns on converting a risk manager who has believed completely opposite these thoughts all of her career, if it turns on converting that person to believe something different, it's never going to happen. Leadership has got to make the connection and say, as part of your job description, you must always keep in mind the core clinical mission, and you must serve that in everything that you do. If you learn from health systems that tried and failed, the VA, I think, talks a good game, but boy, my experience right now is exactly the opposite. The University of Illinois collapsed after several years of actually not pulling it off. It's important to understand what went wrong in those places. There are some health systems earnestly moving in this direction, and then there's aspirants. The Oregon Patient Safety Commission is very interested, and multiple state hospital associations like Connecticut and Utah are. Let me show you just this email. This is very busy, but I got this just in February. I had remembered, but I had worked with these folks at University of Florida a long time ago. They've established a mediation program that has actually reduced their claims, and I applaud them. But someday they're going to realize the deeper meaning of what they've got. Someday they're going to leverage all of these things they're hearing from patients in this safe space that they've created, and that's the real gold here, not just reducing claims. So the collaborative was formed several years ago by Tom Gallagher and Tim McDonald, and it was a great idea. It searched for a while on what its true mission and niche was. Right now, its plans for the upcoming year are to do high-level trainings at a national level, create some standards, maybe with an eye toward certifying organizations, which I would applaud. And then they're doing a great job with some research support and marketing CRP. Lastly, I want to just announce to you that we are forming a training program because I don't think, I'm not satisfied that organically organizations are going to develop these things on their own. We're establishing a training program in partnership with the Michigan Hospital Association, and it is highly inspired by MACRMI's success. We want to, not surprisingly, start with 6 pilot hospitals and move from there, which is exactly what MACRMI did, and I will shamelessly borrow everything I can from MACRMI. And the last thing I want to mention is something that just happened last week. China. The University of Peking called us and is sending a delegation to Michigan. They have an enormous problem between injured patients and caregivers. It's not a malpractice problem. It literally has gotten to the point of violence. They are extremely interested. The National University of Singapore is another one that we have already promised to train. This has got legs in a much bigger way than just locally, and much of it is inspired by MACRMI. So I give you guys a lot of credit. I won't go through the training center because Melinda is now telling me my 20 minutes plus is up. I just want to thank you. Every year I walk away and I think this is so gratifying. If you knew the trajectory of first being told I was crazy all the way to being told I was going to bankrupt the university, to see what you're doing and to watch this in real life is wonderful. Thank you very much, and sorry for going over.
Well, I opened this morning's first session in talking about that this is really just what your grandmother taught you about honesty is the best policy and doing unto others as you would like done unto you. And Rick has just told you the same thing in a much more articulate fashion. So clearly your grandmother and Rick have a lot in common, and you can see the similarities in some respects. This, I think, has been really a remarkable day, and we're going to have a few closing comments, and I'm going to start by inviting Ken Sands up to join me at the podium to provide some thoughts that he has about today's program and MACRMI over the last 5 years. And again, for people who are not aware, Ken was the principal investigator for our ARC grant and really co-chaired MACRMI from its inception while serving as senior VP for quality at the BIDMC system. In January, he got tired of us and moved to Nashville to be the Chief Quality Officer for Hospital Corporation of America's 200 hospitals and 100 outpatient facilities. But he's a dedicated individual and returned just for this today. And so we're going to listen to his closing comments, and then I'll make a few closing comments, and we will be adjourned punctually.
Thanks, Hal. Well, it's great to be back. You know, my professional life right now feels a little bit like the Yoga Bear quote. if you see a fork in the road, take it. I took the fork and am now in Nashville and am managing a new set of hospitals. But it's also feels like I'm still very much here and part of this activity. It does feel a little weird to be transitioning to a guest as opposed to a participant, and it's sad, really. There's such a great community here, and that gives me a great sense of pride and hope. But there's an element of fear there as well, and I'll speak to that in just a minute. It's been an amazing 5 years. When you think of where we started, it was really kind of with Alan's prompting and tireless championship. Let's get together, let's see where we can take this, beginning with the assessment and then beginning with the actual action plan. And I'm not sure we really knew exactly where it was going to go, but it did seem important to get all the players in the room. And now that we've done that, I am absolutely convinced that this is the only way to get this work done. Yes, it's it should be simple. It's all about the principles you learned at home. It's about communication. It's about honesty. It's about keeping promises. And yet it is really difficult. And if I think back on what it would have been like to try and do this work at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center without this community, I just can't even imagine it. I don't think we would have really gotten out the gate. And so I think that we have to look at what we have here in Massachusetts, or what you have here in Massachusetts, now that I'm no longer in Massachusetts. You have an incredibly supportive medical society. You have an incredibly supportive bar association, which has been present as part of the process from the beginning. We have amazing advocacy groups in MITS and the Mass Coalition. And we have an amazing set of insurers that have been willing to go on this journey with us. So, I think in Professor Mello's presentation, she mentioned some of the elements that she thought allowed our institutions to be successful. And a lot of those were about the environment in the hospitals and the environment, the partnership with insurers. But I really do feel like this larger community was a really large part of our ability to be successful. And thus the fear. My fear now that I am in another state is that this state is unique. And that these same elements are not in place to the degree that they are in Massachusetts. And if the secret sauce is this regional model and this level of community that we've created here, then I hope it's present in other states, but we will see. And I think that means that part of our mission, those of us that are doing this work, like the collaborative and what Rick is doing at Michigan and ourselves, really has to be not just teaching institutions how to do this work, but also teaching regions how to do this work, and all pitching in to make it successful. I don't think we've talked quite enough about that yet. One of the things we've created for MACRMI is a readiness assessment that a hospital can use to decide whether it's ready to take the plunge. Maybe we need to create a readiness assessment for a state or for a region so that they can assess whether the elements are in place that will allow them to be successful. So it has been a great privilege for me to be part of these efforts. I plan also on continuing to return to future MACRMI meetings. I place the blame squarely on Alan Woodward for my presence here, and I will be forever grateful. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, we learned a lot, I think, today. We learned that Ken thinks we need a secret sauce. If we want Michelle back next year, we all need to learn how to bake cakes, and we do indeed want Michelle to come back. And from her presentation, we learned that you can implement a care program with fidelity and do what's right for patients and for providers and for the organization and for our healthcare system with no avalanche of new claims or dramatic increase in costs. We also learned from her presentation, and we've heard before, that there's overwhelming support for this type of approach from the providers who have actually been through it and understand the process. We learned from our first panel that optimum conversations with patients about insurer involvement are critical and delicate and need to be balanced. We learned in several discussions the importance of apology, and we've heard this several times, and we know from Segal and multiple others the importance both for providers in dealing with their grief when there's an adverse outcome, and the importance from the patient's perspective on dealing with their anger. It helps diffuse both. So apology, and apology done right, is a critical component of this. And we learned also from patient feedback how to tailor and better tailor the care programs. And I would let you know we've updated several of our best practices and our algorithm, as was mentioned by Melinda, to accommodate and recognize those concerns from patients. And we need to be very careful about making this program attentive to their needs. It will only expedite and improve its success. And finally, in closing, I wish to recognize multiple people that have made MACRMI and today's program a success. And I think it is just absolutely incredible the distance we have come over the last 5 years, and yet the distance we have to go. So first and foremost, I want to recognize Melinda Van Neel, MACRMI. She really, as I mentioned before, she is the brains and organization behind the organization, and she makes it run. So it's been, this is the 5th forum she's run, as well as multiple other educational programs. Likewise, I think we had an extraordinary group of speakers today, and I want to thank all of the speakers especially, and many traveled, as Rick has come back every year from a significant distance. So, and Michelle, who came from, extended her stay, I guess, but is here from California. I want to thank all of the speakers, and I'd like to applaud them. And to the board members of MACRMI, I want to thank you for, as Linda mentioned, they are all crusaders. They really have been unbelievable in their time and commitment as we set up and have run MACRMI. They have spent countless hours making the mission of MACRMI a reality in Massachusetts and even beyond. We also need to thank the healthcare and liability insurers in this state who, as I mentioned this morning, have supported this effort financially. And as we also need to thank Mass Medical for allowing us to use this facility and for supporting us throughout. But, however, ultimately, MACRMI and the progress that this alliance has made would not have been possible if, in 2009, Ken Sands had not accepted the challenge and run with the idea that we could transform an ailing medical liability system for the benefit of patients, providers, and the safety of our healthcare system. So today, all of MACRMI, and I hope all of you here present today, as well as the countless patients and providers who have been touched or will be touched in the future by our care program, thank you, Ken, for your 7 years of unwavering commitment, persistent advocacy, and extraordinary leadership. And now, as we conclude, and as you walk out, please applaud yourselves, because your role is critical here. And again, as Melinda mentioned, your feedback is what allows us to improve our programs and next year's forum, and identify needs or how we can help those of you who are interested in adopting or perpetuating this type of approach. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it. You're a good man.